Church of Smyrna. This is the second church. Last week we covered the church at Ephesus. We mentioned last week the profile of these churches in order of how they are given, give us a history that if it was in any other order, it would not be correct. It wouldn't work with our history. But with the information that Christ gives us from these churches, we see a prophetic and a historical timeline. We talked last week about the church of Ephesus, the darling one, if you remember the name. And it was the apostolic church. It was the beginning. It was the first century. Tonight, we are going to talk about Smyrna, which is the persecuted church. And then next week, 2 weeks out, maybe 3. Might be 3 weeks out. We will talk about the church of Pergamos, and that would be the married church. Just in brief, just to kind of remind you and soften your mind up just a little bit, to remember, last week we talked about all of these letters have 7 divine design elements, and every detail is important. The church name is meaningful. Last week was the darling church. The title that Christ chooses for himself is also meaningful. The commendation, how he encourages them, that's meaningful. There's a concern, there's an exhortation, there's a promise to the overcomer, and then there is a close that says, "He that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches." Each of these letters have 4 layers of application. First and foremost, these each were real churches in Asia Minor in Turkey. All of them were real. They had real problems with real struggles and real temptations, and Jesus deals with them. But also, the application applies to our church and how we run our church. And to be totally honest, if you follow as we go through these encouragements and warnings, you will see our church pretty easy. Okay? So it applies to our church, but also it applies to us individually. And you will see the temptations that you face, the struggles that you face, that they will see as well. They apply to us personally. And finally, again, as I mentioned, the outline of church history. And we'll talk about that as we go. Here in the next slide, just a little bit, as you remember, I showed you right the close last time. Here is the 7 things. The name of the church, the title of Christ, his praise for them, his concern for them, his encouragement to them, the promise to the overcomer, and he that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Now, some of these, like this one, the promise to the overcomer, is after this phrase at the close. But you will see that change as we move through these letters. So, that was just the introduction. Let's start with the church at Smyrna. As I mentioned, the names have meaning. Last week, Ephesus was the darling one, the one he loved. And remember, they had lost their first love. Smyrna, the word comes from the word myrrh. Now, why does myrrh mean anything to us? Right. People brought that to Jesus, but what was myrrh used for?
7.
No, I didn't ask the number.
Embalming.
It was used for embalming. It was used for death. And so the image here for Smyrna is suffering and death. This is the persecuted church. And their persecution is unique to all of the other churches that we will be mentioning. So the title here gives the imagery of suffering and death. Here's the map, and you will see in the next one, this is Ephesus. This is where we were. Now we're going north to Smyrna. This is also on the coast. It also has a port, and we will deal with that as well. But this is modern-day Turkey. In a few minutes, just to give you an idea, we're going to be talking about this fault line right here. and it's going to hold significance to what we're going to be talking about. This is the Syrian-Turkey border. This is Syria right here. And there was a massive earthquake here, if you remember, last year, that literally leveled most of eastern Turkey. Okay? So that's where we're going. But I wanted you to see this in the whole picture, that right now we're on the west side. By the way, we're also going to mention Antioch. You have Greece is on this side. There is the Mediterranean Sea is here, and then it comes up here, and this goes into the Black Sea. And on the other side over there, where it would be green, is Corinth and Antioch and the church at Philippi, all of those. But they're not mentioned in the churches. But that just kind of gives you a church history map so that you can understand just a little bit better what we're talking about. Smyrna is 42 miles from Ephesus to the north. It had a wonderful double harbor. The outer harbor was deep water, but the inner harbor, which you can't access now because of silting, the inner harbor was very close, and they could lock it by a chain. So it had a great way to protect themselves. Today, Smyrna is called Izmir, and it's the third largest city in Turkey with a population of 100,000. In the New Testament time, when there was not near the population of the world, it was still a city of 100,000. Massive. They would export tobacco, grapes, figs, cotton, olives, and olive oil. It was a major trading port for Turkey into Western Greece because, like I mentioned, there's just that small little inlet of the Mediterranean Sea, and you go straight across to Philippi, to Corinth, to Athens. So it's a great trading port. It was the entrance of the valley of Mermus at the mouth of the river Meles. It was a strategic place for trade between Europe and between Asia, and it rivaled Sardis and the Lydian kingdom. Strabo, who was an early historian, I should say, he described the city as the Paris of the Levant. It was one of the most beautiful cities in the world at its day. And so they call it the Paris of the Levant. Smyrna was devastated by Laertes, the king of Lydia, and ceased to exist for 3 centuries. It was a powerful, strong city, and then once he attacked it, he literally leveled it. Now, remember when I told you that everything, all of the details about these cities are important, and they have significance. Jesus picked them for a reason. Well, with this one, after Laertes, destroyed Smyrna, it ceased to exist for around 300 years. But then, as if literally being resurrected from the ground, it came back to life and became a strong city again. Does that story sound familiar this week? It's what we celebrate. It's literally the picture of Christ. Now it took them 300 years. It only took Jesus 3 days, okay? But the idea is they were destroyed. They were dead. But they were brought back to life. And that's going to play very powerfully in the story of Smyrna and in this letter. Alexander the Great ordered Lysimachus, his general, to build a strong, well-planned city to be the most beautiful in Ionia. And it ended up, after Lysimachus rebuilt the city, to be more beautiful than it was before, and a strong, powerful city. And so, even after its death, when it was resurrected, it came to a much greater glory than what it was before it was destroyed. In 27 BC, Smyrna came under the control of the Romans, and because it was a good ally in the Syrian and Mithridatic wars, they had all kinds of rights that other cities did not get. If you were born in Smyrna, you had great rights that you could own for yourself. And you remember some of the stories in the New Testament of people wanting citizenship and paying large amounts for it. They didn't have to do that in Smyrna because they got it. They got it for free. From 27 BC to 324 AD, it just became filthy wealthy. It was a wonderful trade city, trade port, and they got very wealthy. During the reign of Tiberius, though, it was almost completely wiped out by an earthquake. And between 178 and 180 AD, it suffered a succession of seismic disturbances or earthquakes that reduced it nearly to rubbles. And you will see, well, I'll get to that in just a second. Marcus Aurelius restored it again, and parts of his agora, which you saw in a previous picture, are still standing to this day. In 378, another earthquake demolished the city, but they rebuilt again. They are killed off, and they keep coming back to life, the city did, in its history. If you go back into history, and we will see this rather heavily, Turkey, or what they referred to as Asia Minor in the New Testament, was nearly obliterated time and time again by earthquakes. Every 150 to 200 years, somewhere in that range, there would be a massive earthquake. And that massive earthquake would wipe out tens of thousands of people at a time. And they go back, as we have read, as early as 27 BC. And it's on a fault line, like I showed you, right there at the Syrian-Turkey border. Well, there you go, you can see it. This is what happened in 2023, just this last year. You remember that these two massive ones took place almost in perfect succession on this fault line, and because of it, the aftershocks literally leveled everything around. Thousands of people died. They even had in Antioch, right here, they had an earthquake in 115 AD. So just after, within 50, 60 years of Revelation being written, it was less than that, 30 years of Revelation being written, they had an earthquake here in Antioch that killed 260,000 people. There was nothing left. And throughout history, ever since then, there has been a succession. And in 2023, as you see here, this was 7.7 and 7.9 earthquakes. And the succession ones afterwards were, they would go in and rescue people. And as they were going in to rescue people, there'd be another earthquake and the building would fall down on them and kill them. It just happened over and over and over again. And you will actually see in some of the letters that coming into play, because the people were so used to the aftershocks. As soon as the earth would start shaking, they'd run out of their home because they were worried that the house would fall in on them, because it happened so often. Terrible. Go to the next picture there, Daniel. This is a picture of an olive grove. This used to be connected. Those three islands that you see there used to be connected before that earthquake. That ravine was created during all of those earthquakes last year. It's 984 feet long. It's 165 feet across. That's 50 yards. That's half a football field. And it's 130 feet deep. And it happened in a matter of moments. Can you imagine the shaking that took place? So it's still happening, and we will deal with this in later letters, because this happened quite often. So the pagan worship. This was at the foot of the mountain stood the temple to Zeus, the gatherer of the gods, regarded as the Lord of the sky, rain, clouds, and thunder. And along their golden street stood shrines of Apollo, Aphrodite, Asclepius, and Cybele. At the agora, there were statues of Poseidon, the sea god, and Demeter was the goddess of corn. The agora, by the way, that was what we would call a market street. And it was where they had their commerce, where they had their little markets, and you would buy and sell. But then also it was their political center, where you would have the government being run. Worship to the god Cybele. We haven't mentioned her, and she's not normally, we think of Zeus and Apollo and those, but Cybele was rather important as well. She was the protector goddess of Smyrna, and later the Greek Greek Rhea, the daughter of the sky and the earth, and the mother of Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. So she's, the mom of Zeus. Her worship, as you can imagine, was very wild and completely unrestrained. And I'm not going to go into any more detail to just keep this as close to PG as we can, but you can figure out what happened, okay? She was the giver of wealth and depicted as enthroned and wearing a crown of battlements and towers. And in Daniel chapter 11, verse 38, there is a reference to the goddess of fortresses. And it could very well be referencing this goddess Sybil in Daniel chapter 11. Notice, though, what she's wearing. She's wearing a crown of battlements and towers. Again, everything is important. This is the person that they worship. And notice what God promises to give those that overcome. That will come into play later on. They also had Caesar worship. As I said, once Smyrna joined with Rome in the Syrian battle, in the Syrian war, and they became an important city to Rome, they then had Caesar worship. And they readily accepted it. In 196 BC, the Sumerians erected a temple to Dea Roma, the goddess of Rome. And they subsequently built one to Tiberius in 26 AD. The worship of the emperor was forced upon you. If you didn't do it, you suffered great retribution. Each year in their worship, and this is all their worship was, it wasn't much. So it wasn't like they were asking much in human terms. Once a year, you would go to an altar of incense, and you would take a pinch of incense, and you would put it on the fire, and you would say, Kaiser Kyrios. And what that meant was Caesar is Lord. And that was just acknowledging that Caesar is your Lord and your God, and you just did that little pinch once a year. Once you did that one pinch once a year, that's all you had to do, you received a certificate that you did so. Now, Smyrna was a very rich city because of its trade. But they had guilds of labor guilds is what I'm trying to say. If you did not have that paper that said you worshiped to Caesar, you couldn't be a part of the guild, which meant you didn't get a job. That also meant people didn't sell to you. That means people didn't buy your wares. That meant you were penniless. If you didn't have that piece of paper, the government gave no protection. The government of Smyrna gave no protection to you at all. And people could rob you, they could mistreat you, they could do whatever they wanted to you, and the government would not come to your aid. Simply because you wouldn't put a pinch of incense to Caesar once a year. In fact, many who refused, they perished by being burned at the stake. They would be wrapped, and their children would be wrapped usually first in animal skins, and they would throw them to the wild animals for you to watch, and then you were thrown in also. Terrible, horrific things that you can find in Fox's Book of Martyrs that talk about what these people faced because they were not willing to give that pinch of incense to Caesar. So now let's get into the letter. This is in Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. And to the angel of the church at Smyrna write. As we talked about in our first week, this is described to you. God gives us the interpretation of what it is. And the angel that's mentioned here, that's the pastor. By the way, did you know that I'm just an angel? I thought you all would find that funny.
So was Lucifer, dude.
Even Lucifer was. This is true. Hopefully I'm not quite as bad as he. But this was given first to the pastor, and then the pastor was the one that would give it to the church itself. And so this message is to the Smyrna pastor, and this is Christ's title. Right. These things says the first and the last, who was dead and came to life. Now, we mentioned it in our first week, talking about the Aleph and the Tav, that et that goes untranslated throughout the Old Testament 7,000 times. He said there, I'm the Alpha and the Omega, but it's literally the same idea here. I'm the first and the last. No one comes before me, and no one will be after me. I encompass all. I am in control. I am ruling. Okay? But notice, we're talking about suffering and death, right? Again, his name holds importance. Because look, he almost gives them... I'm trying to think of the wording. He gives them reassurance by his title. Many of them are suffering. They're penniless. They're starving. They're hiding. And some of them are dying. But Christ says, I'm the one who was dead and came to life. In other words, guess who has power over death? If you die, guess what I get to do? I have the power to raise you to life again because I've done it already. There's no one before me. There's no one after me. There's no one that has more power than me. I have the power to raise from the dead to life. That's the same issue that Smyrna has been as a city for hundreds of years. Death and rebirth, death and resurrection, death and resurrection. And Jesus is saying here to them as an encouragement, I have the power. I know what you're experiencing. I died too. But I have the power to raise you to life afterwards. And there isn't any other God that can do that. Powerful. As we mentioned in our first, in chapter 1, there's 7 different times that we receive this title that are found in the scriptures, in Isaiah and in Revelation. And it all continues on the same thought pattern there, that there is no one before him or after. So let's go to the commendation. Verse 9. He says, I know your works, tribulation, poverty, but you are rich. And I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. The word I know here is oyada, and it means that I see, I perceive, I understand. But it's not just knowledge. It's not just gaining knowledge. It is a knowledge that is understood through experience. His wording is very specific here. He's not just saying, well, I read it in a book somewhere that you were suffering. That's not what it says. He says, I saw your suffering because I was there. Because I am there. I've experienced it myself. I am where you have been. I was where you are, I have been. But it's not just that he was there and he went through some of the things that they have. No, he says, I know by experience because I am going through it with you. Remember in the first image when John turned around and he saw Jesus standing there, and he saw Jesus in the midst of the 7 churches and holding the 7 stars in his hand. The idea is, I'm not just looking off at a distance and I see it in trouble. Oh, I'm sorry. No. I know it because I'm here with you right now. This is so comforting. Let's be honest. When you get in the midst of struggle, maybe you've been persecuted for your faith. Maybe you've stood up to some other people when they weren't living as they ought. Jesus says here, I'm not going anywhere. All of this that you're going through, I'm right here. I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you. You don't have to cry and scream and jump up and down and cut yourself to get my attention. No. I am with you wherever you go. I have seen you with my own eyes. I am in the midst with you. I'm here with you, and I am holding you together. What a beautiful encouragement. So that's just the first word. I know. and he says, I know your works. And it's very specific too. It's not just works in general. It actually, literally in the Greek says, I know the works of you. And so it's very personal. He says, I'm not just watching. I see exactly what you are doing, George, and you are doing, Smith. And it's the works of you. He knows their struggle. He knows their endurance. Everything they have done, he has seen. Isn't that wonderful and personal? Let's be honest. I don't know about you, but when I'm going through the struggle, I wonder, where's God? That's the first one, right? He says, well, I'm here with you. The second question I have is, God, do you see what I'm going through? Do you see what I'm doing? Have you even noticed the struggle I'm in? And of course, he says, not only do I see it, I'm with you in it. And I'm proud of you as you're doing it. I know your works. Then he says, I know your tribulation. Now that's a big word that we don't often think of. This does not say the great tribulation. All right, just to make note. The word here, by the way, it's a terrible one for someone with a lisp. The Greek word is thalipsis. What it means is pressing together, crushing. It's a metaphor for being oppressed, being afflicted, going through hardship, distresses. Now, I know, that doesn't seem too bad. You're like, well, pressing? I go through pressing every day. I have to get up and go to work, right? This, don't be mistaken, is much worse than our idea of being pressed on every side. It's a lot closer to the word crushing, and I'll explain it in just a second. We all have tribulation, we all have trouble, we all have persecution, but this does not say the great tribulation. We will talk about that one later. But this is the word thalipsis. At its earliest use of the word in Greek, it was used for torture. This is what pressing is. And this is actually Giles Corey, a man in history that died to this torture. This is the modern version of it. What they would do is they would put a board down. They would strap you to the floor. They would put a board down and then they'd start adding weights to it. Okay? What they did during this time was they would strap you to the floor. They would have a large, heavy rock on a rope tied to the ceiling. And they would tell you to recant or to obey or, tell the truth, whatever that torture is for. If you refused, they would lower the rope. And they would ask again. If you continued to not recant, they would lower the rope more and more and more. Eventually, the weight would get on your chest where it would be difficult to breathe. Eventually, you would either suffocate under the weight, the full pressing weight of that boulder, or it would crush your rib cage and collapse everything, all of your vitals. Horrible way to die. Recant Jesus. No, I won't. Recant Jesus. No, I won't. Recant Jesus. Fine. And don't just think that this was in a private room where nobody else saw. Your family members, your children, they would either be under that rock or they'd be watching you under the rock. These are the things that these people faced. If history tells us anything, man's propensity for evil is prolific. And the ways to be evil in the most horrendous ways. By the way, aren't you glad for the Eighth Amendment? That our founding fathers said no cruel and unusual punishment. Now, we've still strayed from that, and we'll go to other countries and do those things, so it's not on our state campus, It's not around our lower 50 or 48. But, yeah. This is what they faced by not recanting Christ. He says, I know your works, I know your tribulation and poverty. And I love this little parenthesis. You think, and I know you're poor. You think you're poor, I know you're poor. But you're much more rich than any of these other churches. Poverty here, there's two words. There's paneia, and that was, you're poor, it's hard, you're living paycheck to paycheck, buying food. It would essentially be like slaves' wages. Nobody wants to have slaves' wages. You know, that's bad. But that's not the word that Jesus uses here. Jesus uses that word, which is poikikia. And that one was the state of poverty where you were resorting to beggary. You literally had nothing. So Jesus, he saw their plight. He was with them in their plight. Jesus says, I know you're suffering, John 16:33 and 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12. If they didn't have that certificate of worship, and they were banned from the trade guilds, the job guilds, that meant they had nothing. And, well, I'll get to that in a second. I don't want to get ahead of myself. Next he says, and I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. We don't often think of it, but as we're going through the book of Acts, who's the first ones to persecute the church? It's the Jews. They persecuted us, and we in turn, Martin Luther and them, treated them miserably. I forget which, there was a rabbi, my dad mentioned it, but there was a rabbi that said Christianity would have been just a simple sect of the Jews. We wouldn't have agreed with them, but they'd just been another denomination. He said, but at its inception, we pushed them out. They did. And when they pushed us out in horrible ways. And then we, in turn, instead of forgiving and being loving, we butchered them and slaughtered them. During the Crusades, the knights had contests to see how many Jewish babies they could hold up on a sword. The Christians here were being severely persecuted by our own brethren. They were Jews, but they were Jews in name only. They were not in worship. The legalism that they had, we read about in Galatians, and Paul wrote heavily in the book of Galatians about the sin of legalism and going back into the law. That's what Hebrews is about as well. And the early persecution came because of that. We were preaching grace and they were preaching the law, and those don't mix. Well, at least they didn't back then. Now they kind of do. People do it all the time, right? But that's where the persecution came from. As we go through the book of Acts on Wednesday nights or Revelation here, you'll see three major problems inside the Jewish community and inside even the church. First was legalism, and it was denying Christ's completed work, going back into the law and doing the things of the law to be saved. The next was Gnosticism, and that was to deny that Christ was human, that he was a phantom that wouldn't leave footprints on the ground when he walked by. But there was also Caesar worship, if I can say it correctly, getting it out of my mouth. And that was to deny that Christ was Lord. Those three things would destroy the church and infiltrate it. And it was a cause for most of the persecution that we're talking about tonight. A man named Polycarp, some of you may know the name or have heard of it in the past. He was actually the bishop of Smyrna. And you find his story in the Fox's Book of the Martyrs. John the Apostle trained Polycarp. and he was anointed by John to be the bishop in Smyrna. In 166, he refused to recant Christ. By this time, he was over 100 years old. As they're preparing to burn him at the stake, they told him to recant, and this is his response. 86 years I have served him, and he never did me wrong. How can I now blaspheme my king who has loved me so? And then there's two different stories about what happened. They stripped him naked and they tied him to the post and they lit the fire. And one story says that he was incinerated. The other story says that the fires were not hurting him. And as they realized this, someone went and grabbed a knife and they stabbed him multiple times and killed him. Don't know which one is true. Maybe one of these days we'll find out. But what a testimony. 86 years I served him, and he never did me wrong.
Was this before the papacy?
Yes, this is before the papacy. This is still while Rome is in rule. This is still while the Roman government is still strong, before its fall and the church take over. All of these torments, these tribulations, these persecutions, all of them could have been avoided by simply just taking a pinch of incense and putting it on the altar once a year. By saying two words, Caesar's Lord. What's the big deal? I mean, couldn't you just drop it down in there? Caesar is Lord, get your paper. Oh, God, I'm sorry. No, you're Lord. All right? I mean, it's something so minor. But for them, even that pinch of incense and those two words were too great a betrayal for the Christ that they served. Church, we have strayed so far. We find any and every excuse that we can to get away with anything and everything we can. And these boys, once a year, they would rather starve to death. They would rather be thrown to wild beasts. They'd rather be set on fire than to put a pinch of incense on an altar and claim that Caesar is Lord. Here's his exhortation. Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested. You will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. Here's my encouragement to you. It's going to be real rough for a long time. But if you endure, I'll give you the crown of life. He wasn't going to sugarcoat it. He knew what they were going through now, and it wasn't going to get any easier in the near future. He was honest with them. But his encouragement was, hey, if you hold out, I will give you more than you ever gave up. As I mentioned, all of the details are important, right? What's one of the main ones that I constantly go to? The numbers. He says 10 days. Well, that's not too bad. Just shy of a week. We'll be all right. I can hold out that long. Unfortunately, when you're writing in Hebrew and Greek, in the ancient times especially, days are not necessarily days. It's mentioning a period of time. And for them, it was a long period of time. 10 days ended up being 10 different Caesars that would persecute the first century church. Nero, you know him, he lit people on fire in his garden to light the garden at night. Domitian, he was the one that exiled John when John was to write and have his vision on the Isle of Patmos. Trajan was next. Marcus Aurelius, if you watch the Gladiator movie, that would have been the time period of Marcus Aurelius. After that was Maximinus, Decius, and then pay attention to Valerian. I've got a video about him in just a couple minutes. Then there was Illyrian, and the worst was Diocletian. That man killed thousands and thousands of people for claiming Christ. After Diocletian, things changed, and we'll talk about that next time we come at the Pergamus church. But the Roman persecution was, after it started, Rome fell into massive famine and pestilence. This is the beginning of its downfall, probably because God is punishing them for their treatment of his people. But they brought back diseases from the Parthian War. The Parthian capital was Babylon. You'd think Iran and Iraq today, that was the Parthian government. And they were fighting Rome. And when they came back, they were terribly sick. And there was massive amounts of famine. People were eating their children. People were selling their slaves to richer people so that the richer people could have those slaves for dinner. And I mean, it was awful. Awful. But because of it, this new up-and-coming belief, this new religion, we can easily blame them. Nero blamed the Christians for Rome burning, right? And the other 9 emperors after him followed suit. Well, the reason Rome's in such trouble is this new religion has angered our gods, and our gods are mad at us until we get rid of them all. And so they tried their best to genocide all Christianity from the world. 5 million believers died during this period of time. And again, it's in Fox's Book of the Martyrs. There's been several recopies. You can find it pretty much anywhere. It is not easy reading, folks. Like I said, man's propensity to evil is unbelievable. And to do it more horrendous than the last guy was almost a contest. In the 20th century, 1900s for you younger ones, before you were born, more Christians were martyred for their faith than all of the rest of the centuries combined. Joseph Stalin alone killed 30 to 40 million of his own people. 50% of them were Christians. Christ promised them here that if they suffered for his sake and they endured, they would receive the crown of life. There's actually several crowns that are mentioned in the scripture. There's a crown of righteousness for those who love his appearing, 2 Timothy chapter 4. There is the crown of glory for those who have fed the flock, 1 Peter chapter 5. There's the incorruptible crown for those who press on steadily, 1 Corinthians chapter 9. There's the crown of rejoicing for those who win souls, 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. There's probably many more crowns. Yeah, there'll probably be a few of those up there too, but there's more crowns, I am sure, but these are the 5 that are listed in the scriptures. So now verse 11. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. These believers in Smyrna literally gave up all. But God promises he is a debtor to no man. And what they give up, he promises to reward, and has rewarded them in heaven, and will reward those as well that follow after them. So here's the admonition to all the churches. Don't confuse persecution with the Great Tribulation. That's something specific, and it's going to be real bad. Just because you may believe in the pre-tribulation rapture doesn't mean that in America we won't escape what the rest of the world has suffered with for the last 1900 years. I believe it was Billy Graham that said, if God doesn't punish the United States, he's going to have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah. And folks, I think we see that coming. Also, do you think, just maybe, America will turn into underground church? Would we be prepared for that? It's possible. There is also an idea here of, he mentions non-Jews. And there's a whole theology that would teach that the blessings of Revelation and the encouragements are only applicable to the church because Israel as a nation has rejected God. And we replace Israel as the body. And it's just flatly false. It's just flat false. The church has a destiny that is not what Israel is. And Israel has a destiny that is not what the church is. And you all better be thankful. Because the time that's coming, the time of Jacob's trouble, is specifically focused on Jews. And it's going to be a terrible time. Worse than any other time. In fact, the scripture tells us that it will be 2/3 of the Jews will be destroyed in prophecies from the Old Testament. All right. Oops. Here's the personal application. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12. Yes, and all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. Aren't you encouraged about that one? All of us are promised persecution if we follow him. Why do we suffer trials? We've been over that several times, so I'm not going to go into that tonight. But we are to be loyal ambassadors. If we claim his name, that's not just in the good times. That's in the difficult ones as well. So as we close, we have the outline here. But did you notice anything, before you click on that one, don't click on it yet. Did you notice anything that was missing in Smyrna of the 7? Something they didn't have that Ephesus did.
I know. I know.
You know, what is it? Go ahead.
The concerns.
The concerns. That is correct, even if you cheated.
Utilizing his resources.
Yes, utilizing resources. That's right. Jesus gave no concerns about this church. He gave them no warnings. He gave Ephesus, his darling church, he gave them warning not to leave their first love. But this church, he says nothing bad about, because he knows what they have endured and what they gave up to endure. It's a powerful thing. All right, that all brings us to James chapter 1, verse 2, 3, and 4. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Count it whole joy, every bit of it. My last encouragement to you is, if you're going through the fire, just know he's in there with you. He sees you. He knows what you're going through. And he is holding you by the palm of his hand. Let's pray. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. It really does mean the world to me that you're getting a blessing out of it. If this video was a blessing, make sure to hit that thumbs up button for me. That way other people can find it as well. Here in the link section, you'll find playlists and new videos that we put out. We try to do 2 or 3 a week. You can also subscribe to the channel by pressing on my face and then hitting the bell icon, and that will alert you to new videos. May God richly bless you.